Middle Way Philosophy, Introductory Video 4A, Non-dualism, Incremental Thinking, Not Metaphysics, by Robert M. Ellis. This is a tributary video to video number 4 on incrementality. In certain strands of philosophical thinking, particularly those influenced by Hinduism and Buddhism, it's customary to talk about duality and non-duality. Duality is basically the distinction between subject and object. The subject is me, the person who has experiences. The object is anything I have experiences of. The distinction between subject and object is enshrined in our language. I sit on the chair. Subject, verb, preposition, object. Of course, this strand of philosophy tends to point out that this distinction between subject and object is not a real distinction in some way. This is the basis of non-duality theory. The object, for example, is not really ultimately distinct from everything else, every other possible object. It just happens to be how we conceptualize that particular thing. There's also no ultimate distinction between the subject and the object. The object only appears to me because of the way in which I see it, or otherwise sense it, or conceptualize it, or categorize it. The object also affects the view of the subject. For example, if I sit on the chair for too long a time, then that very nature of the object will affect me, will affect my physical state, and hence my mental state. The subject and the object, it seems, are not ultimately separate from each other. We may be able to appreciate in the abstract, philosophically, that duality is not the whole story. But duality as a way of thinking seems to be part of the whole way our brains work. Particularly the left hemisphere of the brain represents objects and represents subjects as a kind of object. We do that for very basic reasons, because we're used to picking out objects as things we might eat or mate with or run away from. So duality in this basic sense doesn't seem to be optional. Since we are embodied creatures as well, the very meaning of the words we use does not seem to refer to things that are or are not the case. See the video on embodied meaning in skepticism for more on this. It seems that the question then of duality or non-duality as ultimate states of affairs isn't something that's relevant to us. It's not something that we can talk about in a way that's helpful to us. We cannot justify any ultimate beliefs about the distinction between subject and object, or between different objects. Duality can't be justified in that sense, but then nor can non-duality. We can't deny that belief either. So the only alternative is agnosticism. We need to leave aside and move away from this whole question of whether there's a metaphysical truth at stake here. But let's look more closely at the practical motivations behind this concern with dualism and with subjects and objects. When we think about it, the practical question that's at stake is not about whether there is ultimately a subject or an object. It's more about what sorts of beliefs we have, what sort of complexion those beliefs have about objects or subjects. And that affects how we act in relation to them. Do we get unnecessarily hung on to a particular rigid view of them? So the useful kind of distinction to make about an object is whether it's provisional or absolute. Are our beliefs about that object, for example a chair, provisional beliefs? Could they be changed? Or are they absolute beliefs that indicate an ultimately existent object beyond our experience, which then that conception remains rigid for us? We can't change it in new circumstances. The same applies to our beliefs about the subject, about ourselves. Are those beliefs provisional? Do we recognize that we're changing, for example? Or are those beliefs absolute? Let's think about some of the practical effects of treating objects absolutely. If you take the words of the Quran to be absolutely given by God to provide you with absolute truth, then that can justify you in committing terrorist outrages whilst believing that you are absolutely right to commit those things. If you're obsessed with a car which you believe will absolutely complete your happiness when you buy it, whether or not you make that explicit to yourself, if you implicitly believe that it will give you absolute happiness, you'll be willing to sacrifice other things which really should be more important due to your beliefs about this car as an absolute object. If you're obsessed with a beautiful girl and you think that she can somehow resolve all your problems, again, you're treating her absolutely. You're not coming to grips with the actual complexity of the person that's behind that wonderful skin. Then let's also think of some examples of absolutizing the subject, of treating yourself as fixed or absolute in some sense. One example might be if you identify yourself completely with a political cause, that then becomes you. If that political cause fails or is questioned in some way, you're unable to engage with those criticisms or with those difficulties because you yourself as a whole are threatened by them. Or if you are in a state of anxiety and you identify yourself with that anxiety, you become that anxious person. But the belief that you are anxious rather than just you having anxiety is actually something that creates a positive feedback loop that makes the anxiety worse. In all of those cases then, we're much better off developing provisional views of subject or object. And that can take us to a much more useful way of defining dualism and non-dualism and the differences between them. Dualism, in its more psychologically alert sense, is the belief that absolutization is desirable or inevitable. So if you really don't believe that you can get out of those states, or if you believe that there are certain kind of metaphysical truths that are always there for us, then you're a dualist. But non-dualism is the posing of an alternative, the belief that absolutization can be limited or reduced through practice. And that's where the middle way comes in. The middle way is the avoidance of absolutized beliefs, whether positive or negative. It does require a certain confidence that we can actually make progress in reducing at least absolutization, even if we can't remove it altogether, to practice the middle way. That's where non-dualism, in this sense, becomes necessary. One of the key ways that we can develop non-dualism and practice non-dualism is through incrementality, a practice which has been already discussed in the video with that title in this series. Here's an example of incrementality applied to the example that we already looked at, that is, of the car that you think will absolutely make you happy if you buy it. Supposing you think more incrementally about the qualities of that car or the effects that car will have on you. Rather than being a particular use of money which you either think is absolutely good or absolutely bad, it involves a degree of expense. It also involves a degree of aesthetic pleasure. Let's not deny you will get pleasure out of that car, but perhaps only to a certain extent at certain times, and it will probably reduce over time, particularly as the car itself decays, but also as your attitudes to it change. You'll get a degree of prestige. Well, let's face it, that's why a lot of people buy cars. They're more concerned with the social cachet that they'll get from owning a particular car, particularly a luxury car, than with the actual utility of the vehicle itself. But again, you'll only get a degree of prestige out of it, and it will fade. the car will also produce a degree of waste and pollution. Again, we need to recognize that and include it, but we don't need to absolutize it. It's not going to instantaneously destroy the world, but nevertheless, it's going to have an effect on the world. Finally, weighing these sorts of things up, we need to compare them with other options. Those other options also need to be seen in incremental terms. So, for example, compare this car with other cars, or indeed compare it with not having a car at all, or carrying on with the old one, or using the bus, or using the bicycle, whatever other options occur to you. As in the videos on provisionality and optionality in this series, it's important to consider any particular option compared to other ones, and to look at as many as possible, as many as practicable in the circumstances. Let's also think about non-dualism as letting go of absolute views of the subject by letting go of the view that I am an anxious person. Let's incrementalize that. So instead of saying I am an anxious person, perhaps I could say I sometimes experience a degree of anxiety. That anxiety is more likely to happen in certain situations than others, so it's not a ubiquitous thing. It's not that I will always be anxious in every situation. Already we're beginning to put it into perspective. We can also look at it positively. Some degree of anxiety can be helpful. For example, it helps to prime us for possible dangers and difficulties. It enables us to become more prepared. But finally, a positive view also, my levels of anxiety can change. So where anxiety is unhelpful, it can be reduced through, for example, mindfulness practice. Just as incrementality can be applied to our attitudes to things like cars or anxiety, it can also be applied even to the apparently most intractable claims and beliefs in our lives. This is discussed in more detail in the incrementality video, but here's just a brief mention of some of the apparently intractable beliefs that can actually be tackled by incrementality. The belief that God exists or that God does not exist. The belief that we have a mind that's separate from the body, or just a brain that's just part of the body and reducible to talk about the body. The belief in a nation, and that nation has absolute boundaries, and that some people are members of that nation and others are not. Or the moral responsibility for a criminal act. Either you're responsible for it or you're not. All of these kinds of issues can be tackled more adequately by incrementalizing. To summarize then, duality is the basic separation of subject and object that's talked about, for example, in Hindu and Buddhist type traditions. But our basic ways of thinking, entrenched into our brains, always involve duality as a way of thinking. Non-duality as a metaphysical state is thus irrelevant to us. It's more helpful to see dualism as an assumption that absolutization can't be changed. That's what has the practical effect. So non-dualism should thus be seen as a belief that absolutization can be changed through provisionality, through practices. Incrementality applied to absolute subjects and objects is a key aspect of the practice of non-dualism.